Welcome. In our study today, we're turning to Mark chapter 5. It's a passage where Jesus Christ comes face to face with the raw power of demons, with chronic disease, and even with death itself. And in these three dramatic encounters, we see his authority not just as a teacher, but as the sovereign king. So let's begin and see just how his lordship is put on full display.
Now, before we jump into the text itself, it's absolutely vital that we understand the timeline. As you can see, these events take place during the dispensation of law. The Mosaic law is governing the nation of Israel, and Jesus is on earth presenting himself as their Messiah king. It's important to remember the church age, the age we're in now, has not yet begun. You see, this context is the key to our interpretation, allowing us to understand the text in its plain, literal, historical sense.
So here's our roadmap for this study. We'll begin with a brief introduction and lay some historical groundwork. Then we'll walk through the three key miracles one by one, and we'll finish up with a theological summary and think about how this applies to us.
The golden thread woven through this entire chapter is the absolute, unmatched authority of Jesus Christ. And this isn't just some abstract theological idea. We are about to see this authority in action. We'll watch as his simple command silences an army of demons, as his touch heals an incurable disease, and as his voice ultimately overcomes death itself.
Now, for the historical background. To really grasp the weight of these miracles, we have to understand the world in which they happened. These cultural details, they aren't just background noise. They're actually essential for unlocking the deeper truths that are right here in the text.
You'll notice this chapter unfolds in two very different locations, right on opposite sides of the Sea of Galilee. On the eastern shore, we're in the region of the Gerasenes. This was part of the Decapolis, a league of 10 largely Gentile non-Jewish cities. Here, pig herding was a big part of the economy, and of course, the Jewish laws about ritual purity didn't mean much. But then, on the western shore, we're back in Jewish Galilee, where the synagogue was the center of everything, and where a respected leader like Jairus lived his life under the Mosaic law. Jesus moves between these two worlds with total and divine purpose.
The demon gives a chillingly specific name for itself, Legion. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a random name. It's a direct reference to a Roman legion, a highly organized military unit of several thousand soldiers. This metaphor powerfully communicates the sheer scale, the organized power of the demonic force that was occupying this one man. His body had become a spiritual war zone.
So now we begin our verse-by-verse exposition with the first great miracle of the chapter, the deliverance of the demon-possessed man from the tombs. As Jesus steps onto this foreign Gentile soil, he is immediately confronted by the deepest possible expression of spiritual darkness and human suffering. The way this whole encounter unfolds is just so clear. First, Jesus issues a simple, direct command to the unclean spirit. The power in that command is so absolute that the demons immediately recognize who he is, and they start to plead with him. Third, Jesus permits them to enter the herd of swine, which shows that even their movements are completely subject to his sovereign will. Now, this incredible act leads to the townspeople reacting not with joy, but with fear. And finally, the restored man is commissioned by Jesus himself to become the very first missionary to the Decapolis.
Okay, let's pause here for a moment and put on our systematic theology hats, so to speak. What are we seeing here? Well, from a doctrinal standpoint, first we're seeing Christology, the doctrine of Christ, in its clearest form. He has absolute, inherent authority over the entire demonic realm. And we also see hamartiology, the doctrine of sin. This man's horrific state is a living picture of what sin's ultimate goal always is: to isolate, to torment, and to utterly destroy the image of God in a human being.
This leads us to a really crucial question. A man who had terrorized the entire region is now sane, clothed, and peaceful. So why? Why did this amazing liberation produce fear? Why on earth would they ask Jesus to leave? Well, the answer is tragically simple. It was about economics. The restoration of one human soul cost them 2,000 pigs. They valued their livestock more than a man's life, and because of their greed, they sent the only source of that deliverance away.
After being asked to leave that Gentile region, Jesus crosses back to the Jewish side of the lake. And here, Mark masterfully weaves together two different stories of desperation and faith. The story of a synagogue ruler named Jairus, and the story of an anonymous woman who had been suffering for 12 long years. I want you to notice the tension that Mark creates here. Jairus is pleading for his dying daughter. It's an emergency. But on the way, Jesus is interrupted. This delay is absolutely critical.
because it's during this very stop that the worst possible news arrives for Jairus. Your daughter is dead. This whole structure forces us to ask, what does faith look like when things get worse while we're waiting on God?
And this is where we see something absolutely profound, a complete theological reversal. You see, under the Mosaic law, uncleanness was contagious. If you touched someone who is bleeding, or if you touched a dead body, you would become unclean. The whole system was designed to isolate defilement. But in the person of Jesus Christ, the flow is reversed. Holiness, purity, and life flow outward from him. His touch doesn't become defiled, his touch makes the defiled clean. This is signaling a whole new stage in God's redemptive work.
And notice how personal Christ's words are. He doesn't just let the healing remain an anonymous, almost magical transaction. He stops the entire procession just to find her, to speak with her. He honors her faith, yes, but more importantly, he gives her a brand new identity. He calls her daughter, bringing her out of the isolation of her uncleanness and into the family of God. And he sends her away not just healed, but in peace.
So now we arrive at the climax of the entire chapter. Having shown his lordship over demons and over disease, Jesus now comes face to face with the final enemy, death itself. He enters the home of Jairus, a place now filled with the sounds of professional mourning and utter despair.
As the messengers deliver their report of death, Jesus overhears them, and he speaks directly to that shattered father Jairus. He gives him this defining command, a sentence that becomes a foundational principle for every believer who is facing an impossible situation. Do not fear, only believe. He is calling Jairus to lift his faith beyond the evidence of his senses and to trust completely in the person and the word of the King.
Inside that house, you see two starkly different responses to Jesus' word. When he declares that the child is just sleeping, the professional mourners who know death when they see it, they laughed him to scorn. Their response is based entirely on experience and sight. But Jairus and his wife, along with the inner circle of Peter, James, and John, they respond with a quiet faith. They follow him into the room, taking him at his word against all the evidence.
And in the quiet of that room, the Lord of life performs the miracle with a breathtaking intimacy. He takes the dead girl by the hand, and Mark preserves for us the very Aramaic words he spoke, Talitha cum. This isn't some loud, showy, theatrical display. No, it is as simple and as tender as a father waking his child in the morning. Little girl, I say to you, get up. And at the command of the one who is the resurrection and the life, her spirit returns.
All right, having walked through the text, let us now synthesize the theological truths that have been presented and consider their application to our own lives. Mark 5 is not simply a record of historical events. It is an incredibly rich source of doctrine and a guide for our Christian faith and practice.
This table really helps summarize the chapter's teaching on Christ's comprehensive lordship. Over the domain of demons, he brings sanity and peace. Over the domain of disease, he brings purity and hope. And over death itself, he brings life and astonishment. It doesn't matter if it's on Gentile ground or in a Jewish home. No sphere is outside his authority. No enemy is beyond his power.
So what can we take away from all this for our own lives? Well, we can draw some very clear spiritual lessons. First, just as Jesus did, we are to move toward those that other people avoid. Second, like that restored man, we are commissioned to tell our story of God's mercy, and we start right at home. Third, we have to hold on to his command, do not fear, only believe, especially when we're faced with delays and bad news. And finally, we are to seek true restoration in Christ, not just temporary relief from our circumstances.
The proper response to these displays of divine power and mercy is never casual acceptance. It is complete astonishment. It's an awe-filled reverence. When we truly grasp who Jesus is and what he has done, we are left speechless, filled with a holy wonder at his majesty and his grace. He is Lord over all.
May these powerful truths from Mark's Gospel anchor your faith and deepen your worship of our sovereign Lord. For more in-depth studies, please visit the Grace and Knowledge series blog at woodybrohm.online.